In the vast expanse of the Serengeti, where golden grass stretches endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun, silence can mean the difference between life and death. This is the story of a cub who learned this truth the hardest way possible. A cub who understood, in ways no young animal should ever have to understand, that survival sometimes means becoming invisible, becoming nothing, becoming a ghost in the wilderness that raised him. His name was Simba. The guides who would later study his incredible journey called him by that name, though he was born with no name at all. Just a small lion cub, barely weighing 2 kilograms, born during the height of the wet season when the Serengeti bloomed with life and promise. But Simba's story wouldn't be one of blooming or promise. It would be a story of devastation, loss, and a silence so complete, so absolute, that it became his only weapon against a world determined to destroy him. Before we reveal what happened to this remarkable cub, you need to understand something crucial about the Serengeti. This isn't a zoo. This isn't a nature preserve with rangers stationed every few kilometers ready to intervene. This is raw, untamed Africa, where predators hunt predators, where the strong dominate the weak, and where mercy doesn't exist in any language. If you're ready to witness one of the most extraordinary stories of survival ever documented in the wild, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the will to survive. Simba was born into the Ndlovu pride, a coalition of 3 adult lionesses and 2 large males who controlled nearly 140 square kilometers of prime Serengeti territory. The pride was strong, well-fed, and relatively stable. His mother, Amara, was one of the pride's most skilled hunters, a lioness in her prime, with keen eyes and sharper instincts than most. She had given birth twice before, and both times her cubs had survived to adulthood. She knew how to protect her young. She knew the dangers. She had learned the hard way what the Serengeti demanded. Simba came into the world with 2 siblings, a brother, Kovu, who was larger and more aggressive even from birth, and a sister, Nala, who inherited her mother's intelligence and caution. The 3 cubs were born in a dense thicket of thorny acacia trees, hidden carefully away from the main pride territory. This was standard practice. Lioness mothers understand that their cubs are vulnerable during the first weeks of life. Hyenas would steal them given the chance. Other lions, particularly males, would kill them without hesitation. Solitude, during these critical first months, was the only real protection available. For the first 8 weeks of their lives, the 3 cubs knew only their mother and the small den she had created for them. They nursed, they played with each other, they grew stronger with each passing day. Amara hunted alone during these weeks, leaving her cubs for only a few hours at a time. She was cautious, always bringing down prey close enough to the den that she could return quickly if danger arose. These were precious months of innocence before the harsh realities of the Serengeti would arrive. But in the 10th week of his life, everything changed for Simba in a way that would mark him forever. It began with a sound, a roar that didn't belong in their territory, a deep, resonant call that carried a warning on the evening wind. Amara's ears snapped upright the moment she heard it. She had been nursing her cubs that afternoon, lying on her side while they fed, their small paws kneading gently against her belly. The sound made her body go rigid. She knew that roar. It was Marcus, a nomadic male lion who had been spotted on the territory's eastern border 3 days earlier. Male lions are territorial creatures. They patrol their lands constantly, leaving scent marks, roaring warnings to any competitors that these lands belong to them. Nomadic males, those without a territory, constantly search for new lands to claim. Sometimes they fight existing males and win. Sometimes they're driven away with nothing but wounds to show for their effort. But Marcus was different. Marcus was large, scarred, and desperate. He had been driven from his previous territory weeks ago, and he was now hunting for new lands with a fury born of hunger and displacement. Amara had 3 cubs. This was her priority now, not the territorial threat, not the roaring male in the distance. She needed to protect her young, and she needed to do it immediately. The problem was simple but devastating. Marcus was moving toward her den. The wind was carrying his scent directly toward the thicket where her cubs waited. He would find them. It was only a matter of time. She made a decision in that moment that would either save her cubs or doom them. She couldn't fight Marcus. He was twice her size, and she had 3 dependent young to consider. She couldn't lead him away from the den, because that would mean abandoning her cubs for however long the confrontation lasted. and she couldn't move them far enough to escape his territory. Not quickly enough, not in the gathering darkness. So Amara did something that required every ounce of restraint, every bit of maternal instinct she possessed. She stopped nursing. She licked her cubs once, gently, on their foreheads, and then she walked out of the thicket into the open grassland, directly toward the approaching male. She roared at him, challenging him, forcing his attention onto her instead of the hidden den where her young waited. For Simba, watching his mother leave was the first moment of true fear he had ever experienced. He didn't understand. He didn't have the cognitive capacity to understand. He knew only that the warmth, the safety, the source of his food was walking away. He cried out, a small mewing sound that carried across the grass. But Amara didn't look back. The confrontation between Amara and Marcus was brutal and swift. Marcus was bigger, but Amara had speed and knowledge of the terrain. They fought for nearly 40 minutes in the fading light, their roars echoing across the plain. Other members of the Ndovu pride heard the sounds and came running. By the time they arrived, Marcus had been driven off, but Amara was badly wounded. Deep gashes across her flank, a torn ear, and a bite to her shoulder that was far more serious than anyone initially realized. When Amara finally made her way back to the den, she was exhausted, bleeding, and running on the last reserves of her strength. She collapsed at the entrance to the thicket, and for the next 6 hours, she simply lay there, too wounded to do anything but breathe. The 3 cubs huddled against her, nursing desperately, not understanding the severity of her condition. They knew only that she had returned, and that was enough. For that night it was enough, but infection set in quickly. By the next morning, Amara's wound had become swollen and hot to the touch. She was fevering. She was in pain that transcended anything she had ever experienced. The bite had gone deeper than anyone realized, and now bacteria was spreading through her body with terrifying speed. She tried to hunt that afternoon, but she only made it a few kilometers before the pain forced her to stop. The Ndovu pride came looking for her. When they found her, they saw immediately that she was dying. Lions don't have a word for mercy. They don't have a concept of putting a suffering animal out of its misery. They simply have the law of the wild. If you're too weak to survive, you don't survive. It was that simple. They didn't kill her. They didn't have to. They simply took her cubs. When the pride members arrived at her den while she was gone, they found Simba, Kovu and Nala huddled together in the darkness. Kovu tried to fight. Even as a 10-week-old cub, he snapped and snarled at the intruders, but he was no match for an adult lioness who barely had to move to crush him. Nala tried to hide deeper in the thicket, pressing herself into the darkest corner she could find. And Simba did something that would define his entire existence. He froze, not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from something deeper, some instinct, some primal understanding that movement meant death. He became absolutely, completely still. His breathing slowed to almost nothing. His body became limp, his eyes unfocused. He was there, but he was also not there. He had become invisible. The lionesses tore through the den, pulling Kovu and Nala out into the harsh sunlight. Their cries echoed across the Serengeti, high-pitched, desperate, the sound of young animals being taken from their mother forever. But Simba didn't cry. Simba didn't move. Simba simply waited in the darkness, his body pressed against the earth, his breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the dust around him. The lionesses searched for him. They knew there had been 3 cubs, but somehow they couldn't find him. The darkness of the deep den, combined with Simba's absolute stillness, made him invisible to them. After nearly 5 minutes of searching, they gave up. 2 cubs were enough. They had come for the pride's orphans, and they had gotten them. They left the den without finding Simba. When Amara finally returned to the den 2 hours later, she found only her smallest cub. The silence from Kovu and Nala was the most deafening sound she had ever heard. She collapsed at the entrance, her fever still raging, her wounds still bleeding. She had 2 options now: leave the cub and go after the others, knowing she would probably die before finding them and definitely wouldn't be strong enough to reclaim them, or stay with Simba, care for him, try to keep him alive. Amara made her choice. She lay down and she called her cub to her. Simba crawled from the depths of the den, moving through shadows that had become his entire world. He emerged into the sunlight for the first time since the lionesses had taken his siblings. For the next 3 days, Amara's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her fever climbed higher, her appetite disappeared completely. She could barely move, barely think past the waves of pain that crashed through her body with each breath. But she nursed Simba. She kept him alive. She protected him with the last reserves of her strength. On the fourth day, as dawn broke over the Serengeti in shades of gold and crimson, Amara stopped breathing. Simba was 11 weeks old. He was alone. What happens when an 11-week-old lion cub loses its mother? What survival mechanisms activate? What does an animal do when every instinct tells it to cry, to call for help, to announce its distress, but doing so would mean death? Simba learned the answer by necessity. He learned it by becoming the ghost he had been during those crucial minutes in the dark den. He learned to survive through silence. The first night was the hardest. Simba stayed with his mother's body, nursing from her even though nothing would come. He didn't understand that she was gone. He only understood that the warmth was fading, that the familiar heartbeat he had felt against his small body his entire life had stopped forever. He cried, small, helpless mewing sounds that carried into the night. But as the hours passed and no comfort came, as the body beneath him grew colder and colder, something changed. The cries became less frequent, then they stopped altogether. Simba curled up against his mother's side and waited. By the next morning, scavengers had already detected the scent of death. Vultures circled overhead, their shadows crossing back and forth across the den entrance. A hyena clan, drawn by the smell of blood and decay, began to close in on the thicket. This was the moment that separated survival from extinction. This was the moment when Simba made the choice, conscious or not, that would define his life. He left his mother's body. He crawled deep into the thicket, into a dense cluster of thorny branches that would tear at any predator who tried to follow. And he became silent, not the silence of sleep or unconsciousness, but the silence of absolute will, the silence of a creature who had learned that the world would kill him if he gave it any indication that he existed. He didn't cry for water. He didn't whimper for food. He didn't call for his mother, even though every cell in his tiny body was screaming for her. He was silent, completely, absolutely silent. For 3 days, Simba remained in that thicket without eating, without drinking, without making a single sound. The hyenas consumed his mother's remains. The vultures stripped the den clean. Predators of every kind came and went, drawn by the scent of death. But none of them found the small cub who had learned the most important lesson the Serengeti could teach. Silence is survival. This is where the truly incredible part of Simba's story begins, because on the 4th day of his solitude, starving, desperate, and still maintaining an absolute silence that transcended his desperate need to cry out, something happened that should have been impossible. On the 4th day of Simba's solitude, when his body was already beginning to show the effects of starvation, when his small frame had grown noticeably thinner and his eyes had taken on that hollow look of desperation, a sound cut through the Serengeti silence. A roar, but not the roar of a male lion claiming territory. This was different. This was the hunting call of a lioness on the move. Her name was Zara. She was 3 years old, young but experienced, a member of the Ndovu pride, but not bound by the hierarchy that kept the older females in check. She had separated from the main pride that morning to hunt alone, a practice she sometimes employed when the communal hunts grew too crowded and competitive. She was moving through the grasslands with the kind of focused intensity that comes from genuine hunger, tracking a small herd of gazelles that had been spotted near the waterhole. But as she passed the acacia thicket where Simba was hidden, something made her stop. It wasn't a sound. There was no sound. That was precisely the point. Zara had been hunting in the Serengeti for nearly 3 years. She understood its rhythms, its patterns, its language of survival. And right now, in a place where there should have been the calls of birds, the rustling of small mammals, the ordinary sounds of a living ecosystem, there was absolute silence. That silence meant something. It meant something was hiding. And in the Serengeti, things hide for only one reason. Because they're afraid. Zara's hunting instincts flared. A hidden prey animal could mean a meal. She approached the thicket cautiously, her nose working the air, searching for scent. What she found made her stop dead. Lion cub, newborn or nearly so, alone. Zara had given birth to cubs herself once, nearly a year ago. That experience had ended in tragedy when a rogue male from outside the pride's territory had slipped past the protections and killed them while she was away hunting. The wound from that loss had never fully healed. She had gone through the motions of pride life since then, hunting, resting, being groomed by other females, but something inside her had remained hollow. She approached the thicket slowly, making soft clicking sounds with her tongue. This was not a predatory sound. This was a maternal sound, the same sound a lioness uses to call her cubs to her for nursing. Inside the thicket, Simba heard the sound. Every instinct in his small body screamed at him to respond. This was the sound his mother made. This was the call that meant food, warmth, safety. His tiny muzzle opened, and for just a fraction of a second, he was about to respond. Then something stopped him. Some residual memory of the silence that had saved his life. Some primal understanding that the world had already taken everything from him, and revealing himself might mean losing what little remained. He stayed silent. He stayed still. Zara pushed deeper into the thicket, her powerful frame crushing thorns beneath her, her eyes scanning the shadows. And there, in a gap between two particularly dense clusters of branches, she found him, a cub so small he looked almost newborn, his fur matted and dirty, his eyes sunken from dehydration, his body so thin she could count his ribs from several feet away. But his eyes were open, his eyes were aware, his eyes were watching her with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a young animal. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Zara studied the cub, trying to understand what she was looking at. A solo lion cub was virtually never found alive in the wild. Cubs were vulnerable, and without their mother's protection, they were dead within days. Yet here was one, clearly having survived longer than that, clearly having survived against odds that should have been impossible. She made the maternal clicking sound again. Simba's entire body trembled. Every cell in his being wanted to respond, but the silence held. The silence that had saved him held firm. Then Zara did something that would alter the entire trajectory of his life. She lay down, right there in the narrow space between the thorns. She lay down, lowered her head and closed her eyes. She wasn't forcing herself on him. She wasn't trying to overpower him. She was simply presenting herself, making herself vulnerable, showing him that she meant no harm. And after what felt like an eternity to both of them, Simba broke his silence. It was only a small sound, a tiny mewing cry that barely carried more than a few feet, but it was the first sound he had made in 4 days, and it was the sound of a baby animal calling to its mother. Zara lifted her head and shifted her body, exposing her side. Simba crawled toward her, his movements weak and uncertain, his small legs barely able to carry his malnourished frame. He found her teats and began to nurse desperately, his tiny jaws working with a hunger that transcended anything he had experienced before. Zara's milk came freely. She had not been nursing for nearly a year, but her body remembered what it needed to do. Her maternal instincts, dormant since her own cub's death, awakened with a ferocity that seemed to shake her entire being. She stayed in that thicket with Simba for hours, nursing him repeatedly, allowing him to feed until his belly was round and full. When he finally fell asleep, exhausted by the effort of eating and drinking, she remained there, her body curved protectively around his small frame. But there was a problem. Zara still belonged to the Ndovu pride. She still had responsibilities, still had to answer to the dominant females who controlled the group. Bringing a strange cub back to the pride territory would raise questions. And the pride, Simba's own pride, was the group that had taken his siblings. They would not tolerate an orphaned cub in their territory. They would kill him. It was the law of the wild, brutal and absolute. Zara understood this. She had lived in the Serengeti long enough to know the realities of lion society. But as she looked down at the sleeping cub, as she felt the warmth of his small body against hers, she realized she didn't care about the law of the wild. She didn't care about pride hierarchy or territorial protocols. She cared about this tiny creature, and she would do whatever it took to keep him alive. She made a decision that night. She would keep Simba secret. She would sneak away from the pride during their rest periods. She would bring him milk by nursing and food by hunting. She would raise him in hiding, away from the eyes of the other lionesses who would demand his death. For the next 2 weeks, this is exactly what she did. During the day, Zara would rest with the pride, participating in the normal rhythms of group life. She would hunt with them, run with them, groom them and be groomed in return. But every night, as soon as the other lionesses were deep in sleep, she would slip away. She would move through the darkness with a careful silence that matched Simba's own, returning to the thicket where she had hidden her orphaned charge. Simba, understanding on some level that his survival depended on concealment, maintained his silence during these visits. He would nurse, feed on small pieces of prey that Zara had caught and brought back for him, and then he would retreat into the thorns until the next night. The park rangers who were stationed in the area noticed nothing. The Ndovu pride continued their normal patterns. But something was changing. Something was shifting in the delicate balance of the Serengeti ecosystem. Zara's nightly absences, while brief, were beginning to affect her hunting performance. She was tired, running on less sleep than the rest of the pride. She was also losing weight, because much of her kill was going to Simba instead of being eaten by herself. The dominant females began to notice. They began to watch her more closely. By the third week, the situation was becoming unsustainable. Zara was visibly declining. Her ribs were beginning to show. Her movements were becoming sluggish. The dominant female of the pride, a massive lioness named Amani, confronted her one afternoon as the pride rested beneath an acacia tree. Amani approached Zara slowly, deliberately, making direct eye contact. This was a challenge. In lion society, direct eye contact meant confrontation. It meant dominance being asserted. Zara could have backed down. She could have submitted and been spared whatever punishment Amani had in mind, but instead she held the eye contact. She stood her ground. Amani swiped at her, a casual but powerful strike that caught Zara across the shoulder. The other lionesses watched, waiting to see what would happen next. This was how hierarchy was maintained, through violence, through domination, through constant reminders of who held power. But Zara didn't retreat. She didn't cower. Something about protecting Simba had changed her. She had discovered a strength inside herself that transcended the normal rules of pride hierarchy. She struck back. It wasn't a fight that lasted long. Amani was older, heavier, more experienced in combat. She quickly established her dominance by pinning Zara to the ground and clamping her jaws around Zara's neck. But it was enough to show the rest of the pride that Zara was willing to fight, that she was willing to defy the hierarchy for something she cared about. Amani released her, and Zara stood, breathing heavily, bleeding from several shallow wounds. The message had been sent. Zara was becoming a problem. She was becoming a liability to the pride's cohesion. That night, the decision was made. The dominant females decided that Zara needed to be driven out. Not killed, necessarily, just removed. She would be forced to leave the pride territory and fend for herself. What they didn't realize was that they were giving her exactly what she needed. Zara waited until the pride was deeply asleep, which took hours longer than usual because they were all hyper-vigilant after the daytime confrontation. Then she slipped away, not to the thicket where she normally hid Simba, but to a location several kilometers away, a hidden valley with a permanent water source that she had discovered weeks earlier. She moved through the darkness with Simba following closely behind her. The cub had grown enough in the past 3 weeks that he could walk longer distances, though he still tired easily. But he understood on some fundamental level that survival meant following Zara. Survival meant trusting this lioness who had chosen to care for him when the world had abandoned him. By dawn, they had covered nearly 8 kilometers. They were far beyond the Ndovu pride's territory. They were in a region where other prides occasionally passed through, but where no single group held permanent dominance. It was dangerous territory, but it was also territory where a lioness and a cub might have a chance. Zara found the valley exactly as she remembered it. A rocky outcropping created a natural den. The water source was reliable and clean, and the gazelles and antelopes that migrated through the region provided steady hunting opportunities. This became Simba's new home. For the next 6 weeks, Simba lived in this hidden valley with Zara, and his transformation was remarkable. The cub who had survived by remaining absolutely silent began to emerge. He began to play, to explore, to make the small sounds that young lions make when they're beginning to understand the world around them. Zara hunted tirelessly. She brought down gazelles, took down small buffalo calves when she could find them separated from their herds, and scavenged from kills made by other predators when opportunities arose. Simba grew stronger with each passing day. His frame filled out. His fur became glossy and healthy. His eyes, which had been hollow and desperate, began to shine with the vitality of youth. But there was still something different about him, something that set him apart from other cubs. He was quieter than other cubs would be, more cautious, more aware of danger. The silence that had saved his life had become part of his nature. It had been burned into him at such a fundamental level that it would never fully leave him. By the time Simba was 5 months old, he could follow Zara on short hunts. He was still too small to participate in actual kills, but he was learning how to read the wind, learning how to stalk prey, learning the 1,000 subtle skills that a lion needs to survive in the African wilderness. And then, one night, everything changed again. The night that would change everything began like any other night in the hidden valley. Zara had made a kill earlier in the day, a young zebra that had strayed too far from its herd. She and Simba had fed well, and now they were resting in the rocky den, Zara's body curled protectively around the growing cub. The night was cool, the stars impossibly bright in the African sky, and everything seemed peaceful. But Simba sensed something first. Before Zara even opened her eyes, before her instincts had fully registered the danger, the young cub's body went rigid. He had learned to read the subtle changes in the world around him, a shift in the wind, a distant sound that most animals would never notice, a vibration in the earth itself that carried information to those sensitive enough to detect it. Something large was moving through the valley, something powerful, something that didn't belong. Zara's eyes snapped open. She lifted her head, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent on the wind. Her entire body tensed. This was a smell she knew, a smell she had hoped never to encounter again. It was Marcus, the nomadic male who had wounded Simba's mother all those months ago. The male who had indirectly caused everything that had happened to the cub. The male who had been driven off by the Ndovu pride, but had apparently survived and was now wandering the Serengeti in search of new territory to claim. Marcus was following the same migration patterns that had brought him to this hidden valley. He had no idea that a lioness and a cub were sheltering here, but he was close, very close, and if he discovered them, he would kill them both without hesitation. Zara made a decision in that moment. She couldn't fight Marcus. He was far too large, far too experienced in combat. She couldn't hide with Simba in the den because Marcus would find them there, cornered and defenseless. The only option was to do what she had done once before in her life, to distract him, to lead him away from the cub, to sacrifice herself if necessary to ensure Simba's survival. She licked Simba once on the forehead, the same gesture his mother had made all those months ago in the other thicket. Then she walked out into the night, directly toward the approaching male. Simba watched her go. The young cub understood, on some level deeper than conscious thought, what was happening. He had lived this moment before. He had felt the terror of abandonment before, but he had also learned the lesson that had kept him alive. Silence. Absolute, complete silence. He retreated deep into the rocky den, pressing himself into the smallest, darkest corner he could find. And as the sounds of combat erupted outside, as Zara's roars and Marcus's deeper, more powerful roars filled the valley, as the sound of claws on flesh and teeth tearing through flesh echoed off the stone walls, Simba remained silent. The fight between Zara and Marcus lasted nearly an hour. It was brutally one-sided. Marcus was larger, stronger, and more experienced. Zara was fighting for her life, fighting for the cub she loved, but fighting against impossible odds. By the time Marcus finally drove her off, cornering her against a rocky outcrop and savagely mauling her before allowing her to escape, she was barely able to move. Zara staggered back toward the den, her body broken and bleeding in ways that made it clear she would not recover. She had made a terrible miscalculation. She had thought Marcus would be satisfied with victory and would move on. Instead, he had become curious. He had caught the scent of the cub, and now he was following it. He entered the den slowly, deliberately, his massive form nearly filling the entire entrance. His amber eyes glowed in the darkness as they adjusted to the shadows. He could smell the cub. He knew exactly where it was. The question was whether Simba would reveal himself through fear, through cries, through any of the instinctive reactions that young animals normally displayed. Simba did not move. Simba did not cry. Simba did not reveal himself. Marcus prowled through the den, his claws scraping against stone. He was playing with the cub now, enjoying the hunt, the anticipation of the kill. He wanted to hear Simba cry out. He wanted to see fear in the young animal's eyes. But Simba remained absolutely, completely silent. For nearly 5 minutes Marcus searched, and for nearly 5 minutes Simba remained as still as death itself, his breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the dust around him. The silence that had saved his life in the den with his mother, the silence that had allowed him to survive alone for 4 days, the silence that was becoming the very essence of who he was. This silence saved him again. Finally Marcus lost interest. A cub that wouldn't cry, that wouldn't move, that wouldn't provide any of the feedback that made the hunt enjoyable, was not worth his time. He turned and walked back out of the den into the night. Simba remained silent for hours after Marcus left. Even when Zara dragged herself back into the den, even when she called softly to him, using all the last strength she had left, Simba remained silent. He had learned a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had learned that showing weakness meant death, that making noise meant danger, that the only way to survive in a world this brutal was to become invisible. Zara died that night. Her wounds were too severe, the internal bleeding was too extensive. By dawn, the lioness who had saved Simba's life, who had risked everything to care for him, was gone, and Simba was alone again. What followed was a period that would have killed any normal cub, a 5-month-old lion, barely large enough to hunt for himself, abandoned in a hidden valley with no mother, no pride, no protection of any kind. The odds against his survival were astronomical, but Simba had something that most cubs didn't have. He had learned to survive. He had learned it through pain, through loss, through terror that no young animal should ever have to experience. And he had learned it through silence. For the first week after Zara's death, Simba stayed in the den. He was too grief-stricken, too traumatized to venture out. He had loved her, not with the conscious understanding that adult animals possess, but with the profound instinctive connection that prey animals develop for the creatures who protect them. She had been his mother, his everything, but hunger eventually drove him out. By the 8th day, his body was beginning to suffer from malnutrition. His ribs were showing through his fur again. His strength was fading. He had to hunt or die. Simba had watched Zara hunt dozens of times. He understood, in theory, what needed to be done. But understanding and executing were two very different things. He attempted to stalk a small gazelle on his 9th day alone, using every technique he had learned by observation. But he moved too slowly. His approach was clumsy. The gazelle fled before he even got close enough to charge. He failed 17 times before he succeeded. For 17 days, he stalked prey and failed to bring it down. He survived on carrion, on small rodents he caught, on insects and plants that other lions would never bother with. His strength continued to decline. His condition continued to worsen. And then, on the 18th day, something shifted. Perhaps it was experience finally catching up to instinct. Perhaps it was desperation finally burning away the last of his hesitation. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a primal understanding coded into his DNA through generations of lions who had learned to hunt or die, that finally activated. He brought down a young impala. It wasn't a large kill. It wouldn't sustain him for long, but it was a kill. It was proof that he could survive on his own. It was evidence that the Serengeti, while brutal and unforgiving, was willing to let him live if he was willing to fight for it. From that moment on, Simba's hunting success rate improved steadily. By the time he reached 6 months of age, he was bringing down kills regularly. Not large prey yet. He still lacked the size and strength for that, but enough to survive, enough to grow stronger. The rangers who monitored the Serengeti noticed something unusual during this period. A young lion, seemingly without a pride, had established itself in the hidden valley where Zara's body had been found. They tracked him occasionally, fascinated by his independence, by his ability to survive alone in an environment that typically required group cooperation. They didn't know his full story. They didn't know about Amara, about the silence in the den, about Zara's sacrifice. They only saw an extraordinary cub who shouldn't have survived but had. A cub who had learned to thrive against all odds. By the time Simba reached 1 year of age, he had become something remarkable. He was larger than most lions his age, his frame hardened by the constant struggle to survive. But it was something else that set him apart, something in his demeanor, something in the way he moved through the world. He was still silent, still quiet, still bearing the marks of his traumatic early life. But that silence was no longer a survival mechanism born from desperation. It had become part of his nature. It had shaped who he was at the deepest level. Simba had learned to hunt in silence. He moved through the savannah without making unnecessary noise. He approached his prey with a patience and discipline that made him far more efficient than other lions his age. And when he finally made his kills, he did so with a precision and efficiency that spoke of something beyond simple instinct. The rangers began to refer to him as the Silent One. They would track his movements, documenting his kills, his territorial behaviors, his interaction with other predators. He was becoming a legend in his own right, a lion whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about the social needs of his species. But Simba was not content to remain alone forever. As he matured, as his mane began to develop and darken, he felt a pull toward something more, toward others like himself, toward companionship and community. But after everything he had experienced, after learning that connection meant pain and loss, forming bonds was terrifyingly difficult. The encounter came in Simba's second year, on a night when the full moon hung impossibly large over the Serengeti. He was patrolling the borders of his territory, a vast area that had expanded as he grew larger and more powerful, when he encountered another lion. She was young, barely older than he was, and she was hunting alone like he was. Her name was Sarah, and she came from a pride that had been fractured by drought and disease. She had separated from her group months earlier, seeking to establish independence, seeking to survive on her own terms. When Simba first saw her, his every instinct screamed at him to drive her away. Territory was sacred. Other lions in your territory were competitors, threats, challenges to be met with violence. But something stopped him, something in the way she moved that reminded him of someone, something in her eyes that suggested pain, loss, survival against odds that should have been impossible. Instead of attacking, he simply watched, and Sarah watched back. For nearly 10 minutes they stared at each other across 100 meters of open grassland. Two young lions scarred by life, two creatures who had learned to survive in isolation. Then Simba did something that surprised them both. He lay down, right there in the middle of the grassland. He lay down, lowered his head, and closed his eyes. He was making himself vulnerable. He was showing her that he meant no harm. It was the same gesture that Zara had made to him years ago in the thicket. And like Simba had done then, after an eternity of hesitation, Sarah approached. They did not become mates that night. The connection between them was deeper than that, more fundamental. They had both learned to survive in silence. They had both been stripped down to their very essence by the brutal realities of the Serengeti, and they recognized in each other a kindred spirit. From that night forward they hunted together. They moved through the savannah as a pair, their coordination and efficiency making them a formidable team. The rangers who tracked them noticed something remarkable, a partnership born between two young lions who had no reason to trust each other, who had learned through bitter experience that trust meant vulnerability, and yet had chosen to trust anyway. Simba's territory expanded dramatically once Sarah joined him. Together they could bring down larger prey. Together they could defend their lands more effectively. Together they were stronger in every way that mattered. 3 years had passed since the night that Simba first encountered Sarah in the moonlight. 3 years that saw the young lion transform from a traumatized cub struggling to survive into something far more formidable. A mature male lion in his prime, with a mane that had darkened to an almost black color, with a frame that had filled out to nearly 420 pounds of pure muscle and power. He had become exactly what the Serengeti had tried to kill him to prevent. An apex predator, a king. But kings, even those who had clawed their way to the top through sheer survival instinct, don't reign in isolation. Simba and Sarah's partnership had evolved into something more complex. By the second year, Sarah had given birth to 4 cubs, 2 males and 2 females, all carrying the genetic legacy of Simba's strength and Sarah's intelligence. The small family had grown into something resembling a pride, though one unlike any other in the Serengeti. It was a pride built on silence, a pride where cubs learned early that noise attracted danger, that drawing attention meant death, that survival meant understanding when to be heard and when to remain invisible. It was a pride where the normal social hierarchies and dramatic displays that characterized lion behavior were replaced by something subtler, something more efficient, something that allowed them to dominate their territory with minimal conflict and maximum effectiveness. The other prides in the region had learned to avoid Simba's territory entirely, not because of aggressive displays or territorial roars, though Simba certainly made those when necessary, but because encounters with Simba and Sarah always ended badly for the intruders. There were no dramatic confrontations, no lengthy battles where strength was tested and dominance was established through ritual combat. Simba simply eliminated problems, quietly, efficiently, with the kind of precision that only came from having learned to hunt in silence. The rangers who monitored the Serengeti had begun to notice something extraordinary. In Simba's territory, the ecosystem was more balanced than in any other region they studied. Prey populations were stable, predator numbers were sustainable. There was violence, certainly, but it was violence with purpose, violence that served the greater balance of nature rather than disrupting it. One researcher, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Mwangi, who had been studying lions in the Serengeti for nearly 2 decades, became obsessed with understanding Simba's unique behavioral patterns. She had tracked hundreds of lions over her career. She had documented countless hunts, territorial disputes, hierarchical challenges. but nothing she had ever seen compared to what Simba was doing. She began spending days at a time following him, watching his interactions with Sarah, observing how he raised his cubs, studying the way he hunted with a precision that seemed almost deliberate in its minimalism. And gradually, through meticulous observation and careful documentation, she began to piece together his history. She discovered the remains of the original den where his mother Amara had died. She found evidence of Zara's presence in the hidden valley. She interviewed the rangers who had first discovered the cubs surviving alone in the rocky outcrop. And slowly, she reconstructed the story of Simba's early life, the trauma, the loss, the silence that had saved him, the lioness who had risked everything to protect him, the lessons learned in pain that had shaped every aspect of his existence. By the time Simba reached his 4th year, Dr. Mwangi had completed a groundbreaking study that would challenge everything the scientific community thought they understood about lion cognition, memory, and the lasting psychological effects of trauma on wild animals. She published her findings in the Journal of African Wildlife Studies, and the paper created an immediate sensation. The story of Simba spread far beyond the academic community. It was picked up by journalists, by wildlife documentarians, by social media accounts dedicated to animal behavior. The Silent One, as the rangers called him, became famous. Not in the way that celebrity animals often became famous, through dramatic footage or sensational incidents, but through the quiet, steady evidence of a lion who had learned to transcend the normal limitations of his species through survival. But fame, even the kind that came through scientific papers and wildlife documentaries, had consequences. Tourism in that region of the Serengeti increased. More vehicles came to observe Simba and his pride. More people wanted to witness the extraordinary lion who hunted in silence. And with increased human presence came increased human interference, however unintentional. It was during this period, when Simba was at the height of his power and influence, when his pride was thriving and his territory was secure, that something happened that would test everything he had learned about survival and silence. The rival coalition appeared on the northern border of Simba's territory on a morning when the sun burned like fire across the savannah. 3 young males, barely into their prime, but large and powerful and hungry. They had been driven from their previous territory by an older coalition, and now they were searching for new lands to claim. Simba's territory, rich with prey and water sources, was exactly what they were looking for. They announced their presence the way young males typically did, with roars that carried for miles, with aggressive scent marking, with all the dramatic displays that had characterized lion behavior for millennia. They were challenging Simba, demanding that he either accept their presence or fight to drive them away. Under normal circumstances, Simba would have responded with roars of his own. He would have patrolled his borders aggressively. He would have engaged in the ritualized displays that typically preceded territorial disputes. He might have even fought them, a violent confrontation that would determine dominance through strength and combat skill. But Simba had learned something that most lions never understood. Silence was more powerful than noise. He did not roar back at the intruders. He did not engage in aggressive displays. He simply ignored them. He went about his daily routine as if they didn't exist. He hunted, he rested, he tended to his cubs, he groomed Sarah. He acted as though 3 challenging males on his border were beneath his notice. The strategy was devastating. The young males, hungry for conflict, for the chance to prove themselves, for the opportunity to engage in the dramatic territorial disputes that all lions lived for, became increasingly frustrated. They roared louder, they marked more extensively, they grew increasingly aggressive and increasingly desperate. And then, on the 5th day of their presence, they made their mistake. In frustration at being ignored, one of them crossed deep into Simba's territory and attempted to make a kill on prey that belonged to his pride. It was a direct challenge, a line crossed, an action that could not be ignored. Simba's response was sudden and devastating. He didn't roar, he didn't make any dramatic display. He simply hunted the intruding male like he would hunt prey, with the same silence, the same precision, the same efficiency that had defined his hunting style his entire life. When the confrontation was over, the young male was dead, not from an extended battle, but from injuries inflicted so precisely, so efficiently, that death came quickly. The other 2 males, witnessing what had happened to their companion, made the calculations that all animals made in the wild. This territory wasn't worth dying for. They retreated, leaving behind 1 less male and a message that would spread through the region. This territory was claimed. This territory was defended. and the male who controlled it was far more dangerous than his silence suggested. But the killing of the intruding male had consequences that Simba hadn't anticipated. It had brought human attention to his territory in a way that the previous years of quiet dominance had not. The rangers had witnessed the confrontation from a distance. Photographs had been taken, reports had been filed, and word had spread that Simba, the silent one, was not quite as gentle as his quiet demeanor had suggested. The narrative changed. Where once Simba had been celebrated as a lion who had transcended the typical aggressive behaviors of his species, now he was viewed with suspicion. Some researchers began to suggest that his silence wasn't a form of intelligence or adaptation, but rather a symptom of deep-seated aggression, violence contained but not eliminated. Dr. Mwangi pushed back against this interpretation. She understood what the other researchers didn't, that Simba's silence wasn't the absence of aggression. It was aggression refined, perfected, weaponized through experience. A lion didn't learn to kill as efficiently as Simba had learned by accident. He learned it through necessity, through survival, through understanding that waste was death. But the damage to Simba's reputation had been done. Conservation organizations that had previously celebrated his story now began to question whether he represented the kind of lion that should be protected. Tourism in the region became more complicated, more fraught with tension between those who wanted to witness the legend and those who feared what the legend represented. For Simba himself, none of this mattered. He continued to live as he had lived, moving through the Serengeti with Sera and his cubs, hunting in silence, raising his young to understand that survival meant more than just physical strength. It meant understanding the world deeply. It meant reading subtle changes in wind and earth and scent. It meant knowing when to act and when to wait. It meant embracing silence. By Simba's 5th year, his first generation of cubs had matured into young adults. The 2 males had left the pride to seek their own territories, as was the way of lions. The 2 females remained, and between them they had given birth to 8 cubs. Simba was no longer just a lion, he was a founder. He was creating a legacy. He was spreading the lessons he had learned through pain and suffering to a new generation, and those lessons were creating something unprecedented. In regions where Simba's bloodline was present, where his genetic legacy was spreading, wildlife biologists began to notice changes in lion behavior, a decrease in unnecessary aggression, an increase in hunting efficiency, a more stable ecosystem balance. It was as if Simba's trauma, filtered through generations, was creating a better adaptation for lions to survive in the increasingly stressed African wilderness. Dr. Mwangi continued to study him. She published additional papers. She gave lectures to universities around the world. She told the story of a cub who had learned to survive through silence, who had transformed that silence into a form of power, who had created a legacy that would outlast him. But she also documented something else, something that the other observers had missed or perhaps didn't want to see. In Simba's eyes, even at the height of his power, even surrounded by his thriving family and dominating his territory completely, there was still a shadow, a reflection of the trauma that had shaped him. The silence that had saved him was also a silence that had cost him something fundamental, a lightness, a joy, a freedom that animals shouldn't have to surrender. In her final paper, published when Simba was 6 years old, Dr. Mwangi wrote something that would become the most quoted passage from her lifetime of research. Simba survived by learning that silence was survival, but survival itself is not living. He thrives in his territory, excels in his role as protector and provider, succeeds in every measurable way, and yet there remains in him a question that I believe he carries every single day of his life. What would I have been without the trauma that made me strong? What would I have become if I had never learned that sound meant death? It was a question that Simba himself could never have articulated, but it was a question that lived in his silence. It was a question that haunted every moment of his existence, because survival at the cost of your essential self is never quite the same as simply being alive. The final chapter of Simba's documented story came in his 7th year, when he was already showing the first signs of age. His mane was still magnificent, but there were threads of grey in it now. His movements were still efficient, but slightly less fluid than they had been in his prime. He was entering the period that all lions eventually reach, where their reign could not last forever. He had maintained his territory successfully through multiple challenges. He had raised a successful family. He had created a legacy that would outlast him. By every measure of lion success, he had achieved what few lions ever achieve: stability, prosperity, the knowledge that his genes would continue, that his lessons would be passed on, that he had contributed to the world in a meaningful way. But there was one last test, one final challenge that would determine the true measure of what Simba had become. The lion that appeared on the border was massive, even larger than Simba. He was old, perhaps 8 or 9 years, which meant he was ancient by lion standards. His mane was scarred and faded, bearing the marks of countless battles. His body was covered in old wounds, each one telling a story of survival and violence. This was a lion who had lived an entire lifetime of roaring, of fighting, of commanding through sheer presence and strength. And this old lion was dying. His territory had been taken by younger males. His pride had abandoned him. He was starving, wounded, reduced to wandering the Serengeti, seeking any place where he might survive his final days. He discovered Simba's territory, quite by accident, driven by desperation and hunger. And when he encountered Simba, something remarkable happened. Instead of fighting, instead of engaging in the confrontation that both of them had been trained by evolution to engage in, Simba simply acknowledged him. He approached the old lion with his typical silence, and he made a gesture that no one had ever documented a wild lion making before. He shared his kill, a fresh zebra that he had brought down that morning. He placed the old lion at the feast, allowed him to feed first, and waited until the ancient predator had eaten his fill before consuming what remained. For 3 days, Simba did this. Every day he would hunt, and every day he would share his kill with the dying old lion. He didn't care that this lion was technically an intruder in his territory. He didn't care about the rules of dominance and hierarchy. He only knew that this creature was suffering, and his silence understood something that noise never could. The old lion died on the 4th day, having eaten well, having experienced kindness in his final days. He died peacefully, in the shade of an acacia tree, with Simba resting nearby. When the rangers discovered the scene, they were baffled. They found no evidence of conflict. They found no indication of the territorial dispute that they would have expected. They only found an old lion, dead from age and starvation, with another lion resting nearby. Dr. Mwangi, now retired but still monitoring Simba's story from a distance, received photographs of the incident, and when she saw them, she understood. This was the answer to the question she had posed in her final paper. This was what Simba had become, stripped of all the noise and all the drama that typically defined lion existence. He had become something that transcended survival. He had become something deeper, something that suggested that consciousness, that understanding, that genuine compassion could exist in the wild, even in creatures shaped by violence and trauma. Simba's reign continued for another 3 years. He never became as large or as aggressive as he might have been if he had followed the typical lion trajectory. He never accumulated the kind of dramatic story that captivated audiences. He never roared as loudly or fought as dramatically as other legendary lions. Instead, he simply existed. He hunted. He raised his family. He maintained his territory. He lived his life with a quiet mastery that left the Serengeti itself better than he found it. And when he finally died at the age of 10, it was peacefully, in his den, surrounded by his pride. The rangers who found him wept. Even though they were trained professionals, even though they understood that death was part of the cycle of life, they wept, because they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a lion overcome trauma through silence. They had seen a creature use pain as a teacher rather than a destroyer. They had seen, quite simply, greatness. Dr. Mwangi wrote one final paper, published after Simba's death. In it she recounted his entire story, from the desperate cub hiding in silence in the den, to the young lion learning to survive alone, to the mature predator who had created a legacy that would outlast him. And in the conclusion, she wrote something that seemed to capture the essential truth of what Simba had been. In the study of wild animals, we often focus on the dramatic moments, the hunts, the battles, the territorial disputes, the roars that shake the savannah. But sometimes, the most powerful forces in nature are the quiet ones, the silent ones. Simba was not the largest lion in the Serengeti. He was not the most aggressive. He was not the most prolific breeder. But he was, without question, the most transformative. He took the worst that nature could offer and turned it into something greater than survival. He turned it into wisdom. In the years after Simba's death, researchers noticed something remarkable. The lions descended from his bloodline, those who carried his genes and, perhaps in some ineffable way, his lessons, continued to demonstrate the behavioral patterns he had pioneered. They hunted more efficiently. They resolved conflicts with less violence. They created more stable prides and more balanced ecosystems. It was as if his silence had become contagious, as if the lessons learned through trauma had encoded themselves into something deeper than just individual behavior, something that could be passed on, that could be spread, that could change the nature of an entire species from the ground up. The rangers who had known Simba in life continued to tell his story long after his death. They told it to tourists, to students, to anyone who would listen. And the story of the cub who had survived by hiding in silence became a legend that spread far beyond the Serengeti. It spread to universities and research centers around the world. It became the subject of documentaries and books and academic studies. But more importantly, it became a reminder that trauma doesn't have to define us, that pain can be transformed into power, that silence, properly understood, can be louder than any roar, that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from the dramatic and the obvious, but from the quiet and the profound. Simba had survived by learning to hide in silence, but ultimately, his legacy was not about hiding at all. It was about discovering that within silence, within the space where noise had no place, there existed a form of understanding and wisdom that could only be learned through the harshest tests that life could offer. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of his remarkable life, that the greatest transformations often begin in silence, that the deepest wounds can become the deepest sources of wisdom, that a cub who learned to survive through hiding could eventually teach an entire species something new about what it meant to truly live.